Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers, de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Listeners to this podcast will know that I had the absolute privilege to attend a symposium in Yale last year. And while there, I met a lot of super interesting, incredibly smart people. And this week, I'm very excited to be joined by one of those people. Brendan Shanahan is a lecturer in the Department of History and an associate research scholar at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale University. Dr. Shanahan teaches courses on North American immigration and citizenship policy and comparative U.S. and Canadian political and legal history. Prior to joining Canadian Studies, he served as a postdoctoral associate at Yale Center for the Study of Representative Institutions. And even before that, Dr. Shanahan earned his PhD and MA from the University of California, Berkeley, where he was an active member of Cal's Canadian Studies program. And it's something that I am particularly jealous of. He received his BA from McGill University in Montreal. Dr. Shanahan's first book is Disparate Regimes, Nativist Politics, Alienage Law, and Citizenship Rights in the United States, 1865 to 1965, a book we will be spending some time talking about on this episode. Brendan, welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Jesse, thank you so much for having me. What a kind intro, and thrilled for the invitation. Really looking forward to talking to you and your audience.
Well, this will be cool. So before we get going on your work, though, I would like to get your background, because it does seem unusual for someone with the name of Brendan Shanahan to be focusing a major part of their academic and professional career on French-Canadian, Franco-American history. So kind of where are you from? How'd you end up in this line of work?
So I'm a New Englander myself. I grew up just outside of Worcester in Massachusetts. And though I'm not Franco-American myself, I did grow up surrounded by, in many areas similar to your own in Manchester, just a ton of French-Canadian origin families. Indeed, some of their grandparents still spoke French. My dad's boss, when I was a little kid growing up, who's also a family friend, French was his native language. And so there was this presence growing up in the 90s that, I don't know, just as a nerd, curious kid, I just found, how is this still a thing? This is really fascinating. Awesome. Coupled with that, my family didn't take big summer vacations. We were skiers, and we just started going up to in and around Quebec City for winter vacation to go skiing. And I just, in that process, grew up developing a passion for French language, kind of Franco culture. That plus cost considerations circa 2007, 2008,
of course, sure.
Led me to study at McGill. At the time, every class, language class that I took in French was more or less covered by the Quebec government. I minored in French.
Very nice.
And majored in history. Didn't know what I was going to go study there, but I really fell in love with being able to learn both American history from a Canadian perspective,
sure, and
courses on Canadian history, which were deeply, deeply tied to migration history, both within Canada, within North America, and people's coming to and from different parts of the world to both the U.S. and or Canada, sometimes in tandem. I couldn't get enough, and so my summers coming back to Massachusetts, I spent a lot of time at Assumption College, now Assumption University, where they have the wonderful French Institute. Shout out to Leslie Choquette and her team there. She really kind of took me under her wing and was like, hey, here's what archives are as opposed to just a traditional library. And this sounds like fun. By the time I was between junior and senior year, I was doing that bit part-time and using it as an intern, work to intern at the Museum of Work and Culture in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, as they were doing this renovation project to incorporate more immigration history as part of a translation process, making a lot of that museum bilingual in English and in French. So that process convinced me. I already had an inkling, I really want to become a historian. And I took a pretty big turn, went to Cal Berkeley, other side of the country.
Yeah, pretty big swing, sure.
But part of what drew me there is they have both, in addition to having a very strong immigration program, not just in history, but across disciplines. They also have a really strong Canadian studies program. So I was able to keep my foot in both worlds. And one of my advisors at the time, Irene Bloomerad, she's recently moved on from Cal Berkeley. She's at University of British Columbia now, ran both programs. So she really took me under her wing and allowed me to continue working in Canadian history, Canadian migration, keep my foot in the door in that space, even as my work moved more in the direction of comparative politics and legal history, and not looking at any one particular migrant community over time, but laws governing migrants, particularly focusing on citizenship status. Graduated, got my PhD in 2018, lectured at Cal for a little bit, and got a postdoc at Yale, where my job was, in addition to teaching, was revising that dissertation, expanding it into a book. That was accomplished. I published the book more or less this time last year. And a few years ago, I moved over to the Canadian Studies program, where now I'm really thrilled because I get to do a 50-50 gig where I'm lecturing in the history department and working in Canadian studies. My teaching is pretty 50-50 U.S. Canadian history, and that's where my newer work is going back to as well.
Very, very cool. Definitely an interesting path, taking you to a bunch of different places. But let's talk about this book,
Sure.
Disparate Regimes. Big picture, before we get into too much details of this book. What is this book about?
Okay, great question. So the book is more or less tries to make two arguments. And the first is embedded in its title, this idea of disparate regimes. That is an argument that between the Civil War and Civil Rights era, state governments, through either constitutional law, states having constitutional conventions, or by the laws passed by state legislatures, had a real significant power and greatly shaped the lives of immigrants in their respective states by passing laws known as alienage laws. That is, laws that define the rights of non-citizen immigrants or aliens compared to those of U.S. citizens. Those laws varied so greatly and mattered so materially that they amount to what I term a disparate regime. In immigration history, there's a lot of times scholars will kind of track the growing power of the federal government in shaping immigration and policies governing immigrant rights. And here I'm trying to say states had real powers and used them for a significantly longer period of time than is generally emphasized in that literature. And the second argument is that those types of laws and the politics surrounding them didn't just affect immigrants, but they had a lot to do with how popular perceptions and legal and political ideas about what are citizenship rights for all people resident in the U.S. Over the course of that century. Women's history in particular is crucial here to my story, as a lot of, for instance, women suffragists were arguing voting should be a right of citizenship and only available to U.S. citizens at a time when, indeed, a lot of states said you didn't have to be a citizen to vote. You could be a male immigrant so long as you're in the process of becoming a citizen. So, big picture, that's the scope. I can't look at all possible alienage laws that vary, distinguish the rights of citizens versus non-citizens. And so I focus on a few types of them. Laws that, like I was just saying, non-citizen voting rights laws or alien suffrage laws, which were particularly common in the 19th century. They're opposite. Laws count non-citizens out of the population when drawing state legislative districts. This is called apportionment law. There's a big debate about this in New Hampshire in the aftermath of World War I. A host of blue-collar laws, which tried to, and sometimes very much did, restrict or ban non-citizens from certain types of public and publicly funded employment. Think public works jobs, public school teachers, and professional licensure laws. By the time of World War II, there were nearly 500 licensing laws across the country, again, mostly state level, saying to work as a doctor, to work as a nurse, architect, pharmacist, you name it. You either have to be a citizen or in some cases in the process of becoming a citizen. And then the last topic I look at, again, bringing it to women's history, is the experiences of marital expatriates. Now, these are women, American-born women, who in the early 20th century lost their U.S. citizenship when they married immigrant men. Any American-born woman who married a non-citizen man between 1907 and 1922 lost her citizenship under federal nationality law, and some mostly East and South Asian women continued to do so until 1931. And so that last chapter is just an exploration of how many women lost. I count a ton of naturalization files to try to make estimates of how many women lost and tried to regain their citizenship. And it's a way to flip the coin, so to speak, and look at the story that I've just been describing in the previous chapters and see how these increasingly restrictive laws distinguishing citizens from non-citizens materially affects people, because most of these American-born women didn't know that they had become immigrants in their own country until something happens to them. When they try to register to vote, when they try to be a public school teacher, you name it. So that's the big picture.
I would like to get into some of these, though.
Sure.
For sure. I mean, obviously, I appreciate the big picture highlights. Obviously, we were talking to the population that listens to this podcast. This isn't your book isn't I would call it, it's like a U.S. history book.
Mm-hmm.
But Canadians play
Come up in every chapter.
Play a significant role in your book. Please tell us kind of how they're woven into this story.
That is one of the things that I really, I was so grateful that my Canadian history training informed this project. And part of it is just being immersed in it. A lot of the kind of theoretical way I kind of wrestled this very, very big picture project into a book was from learning about Canadian politics and the nature of Canadian federalism, which is something a lot of, frankly, historians and other scholars in Canada have incorporated into their studies of immigration more than in the U.S. So from the very beginning of the project, my introduction, I don't think I could have wrestled this project together in what I hope was a coherent way had I not been engaging with works about Canadian immigration, Canadian federalism more broadly. On each of these different dimensions, I would just say that Canadians, Canada, and often Francophones, be they Francophone North Americans native to the United States, French-speaking populations in Canada, loom pretty large in sometimes as a comparative dimension that American politicians are debating as substantial migrant populations within the United States as a major labor force, and as a group claiming membership either as immigrants naturalizing or as second and third generation groups, saying we're just as American as anybody else. Let me give you a few examples there.
Please.
I was talking about non-citizen voting rights. Well, Louisiana was one of the states that had non-citizen voting rights into the late 19th century, and when the Jim Crow segregationists and white supremacists are trying to pass their Jim Crow constitution in Louisiana, as part of a Southern mass disfranchisement of African Americans. They themselves, so that the segregationists in the 1890s are split among themselves as to, all right, if we do a literacy test, what are we going to do about individuals who speak a different language but are white and might be literate or not? Might be literate in one language but not another. And so French language voting rights and French-speaking populations, both like based in New Orleans, one community, and then the Cajun population in particularly Southwest Louisiana, becomes a major focal point of that debate itself, and forces more or less, what they adopt is basically proxies to disfranchise African Americans and more or less provide carve-outs for white French-speaking individuals. So that's just from the very beginning, and I didn't go in trying to find that. That's just what the archive was very clearly like. Wow, this is front and central in this particular state debate. When it comes to attempts to restrict or bar immigrants in a bunch of states from having public or publicly funded jobs, border crossing, Michigan and Ontario, and fear of competition with migrants from both Anglo-Canadian and French-Canadian migrants is there from day one in the 1880s, and in that as these types of debates are really starting to gain traction, which is more or less the same time as the infamous reference by a Massachusetts statistician and policymaker, Carol Wright, when he makes the infamous claim that French Canadians are the quote unquote Chinese of the eastern states. And you can see the way in which politicians, labor leaders, Canadian migrants themselves are debating the relative position of Canadian migrants, French Canadian migrants in particular, vis-a-vis other working class populations. It depends on some states more than others. These considerations play a real role in how politicians are appealing to their voters and the policies they do or don't adopt, and vice versa. The last element that I'll add, and I could go further, is the role of Canada in the American political imagination. Right now we're living in a moment where Canada looms very large in American political culture in the year 2026. It's fair to say that 2026 is a high point relative to others, but too often I think Canada is written off as something that is not present in the American popular consciousness, or kind of elite discussions of ways of doing politics and other possible models. And so, for instance, in the 1890s, when a bunch of kind of northeastern elites are warning against states that have non-citizen voting rights laws and lobbying those states to repeal them, in one case, one of these self-described reformers argues we have to do it or else we're going to turn into Canada, by which he means we're going to be so internally divided, just like the Anglo-Canadians and the French Canadians are divided. We all know that Canada is eventually going to break apart because the center cannot hold in Canada. Let's not do that to ourselves. Of course, this is the 1890s.
Sure.
This is a period of real, strains in the Canadian, then relatively young Canadian Confederation, often dealing with questions of race and language, ethno-racial divisions. But, that was the 1890s. This is the mid-2020s. Canada is still united and still looming large as a reference point for American political debate and alternative ideas of how countries can come together or come apart.
And I'm glad you mentioned our friends in Louisiana. We got a lot of listeners from the Louisiana area because
Right.
we share a lot in common with kind of some of the challenges they face down there up here in New England. So I'm glad we touched on that. But obviously, I'm a New England guy.
Yep.
We got New England as the logo for the podcast.
You got it.
So I would love if we could touch a little bit more. You mentioned some of the things I'd like to get into a little bit. Of course, you talked about the Canadians of the eastern states. We've talked about that briefly on our podcast previously with David Vermette. It's mentioned in his book as well. But also what's going on in New Hampshire, because that was something I was not particularly familiar with. And again, I'm a Manchester, New Hampshire guy. So I think that would be pretty cool. What else is happening here in New England?
So, okay, great. The long and short of it is that by the late 19th century and definitely into the early 20th century, the Northeast, broadly speaking, and New England in particular, there are no more non-citizen voting rights laws, and there haven't been for quite some time. And on the contrary, this is where attempts to count immigrants out of the population, again, for state legislatures, if they're non-citizen immigrants. 14th Amendment, Congress, the Electoral College has been and is very clear. Everybody counts, citizen, non-citizen alike, and that's been the case for federal history of redistricting and reapportionment. Quite a few states, Massachusetts was one of them, Maine was another, had counted non-citizens out of the population when drawing state legislative districts, going back to before the Civil War. By the time of World War I and a period of intense, really anti-radicalism, xenophobia, and a lot of states are having state constitutional conventions at the time. New Hampshire is one of them. New Hampshire is pretty unique in the sense that it has an enormous state legislature, still does.
Still do, yeah.
At the time, even larger. And
I got 2 terms in it myself.
Yeah. It's not quite the same as being a state senator in California. I believe they have larger districts, larger constituencies than members of Congress. Whereas in New Hampshire, not quite the same.
Not quite.
But so there's a part of there's an attempt to reduce the size, to make it a little bit smaller. One of the subjects that comes up in this moment is, all right, what's the basis of the population going to be? Some generally rural or small town lawmakers try to do this thing where they either count non-citizens out of the population or use similar metrics more or less as proxies of doing so. And they're particularly making arguments about the relative quality of current immigrants in 1919, 1920, stuff like that, and making denigrating references to people from Southern and Eastern Europe. And it tends to be politicians from places like Manchester, or the bigger towns, the larger cities, who make the argument, hold on, we heard these same derogatory arguments about French Canadians coming in 20, 30 years ago. And before that, you made these derogatory comments about Irish immigrants. This is an old argument. And I guess, to put it most succinctly, the success of Irish, French Canadian immigrants in and importance to the economy, civic society of a place like New Hampshire was used as a counterweight to arguments against so-called more recent immigrants. New Hampshire did not adopt that policy, but an attempt to repeal that same one in Massachusetts at the same time also came up short. So that's kind of the political question of who's included in the political community, and to what degree, comes up a lot in New England. The second is just that New England and the Northeast more broadly, New York especially, has a ton of these laws restricting employment and licensure to citizens or privileging citizens vis-a-vis non-citizens, given the continued migration of peoples from Canada from the mid-19th century into basically the Great Depression era, and in some cases after, depending on what time these laws were really in vigor, they materially affected Canadian immigrants, French Canadian immigrants, in hard times when when people who otherwise might not have wanted to do public construction work were looking around, and that might have been the only job available. That's when these laws tended to, snap into place again, and could really limit people's opportunity.
Yeah, and along those lines, one of the ones that you write about in your book that I found interesting, and obviously has a tie to Canada, is when you talked about the nurses in Boston.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can you give kind of our background of the nurses?
So this is mostly Anglo Canadians, but it's super relevant. So the old joke about in the Maritimes in the early 20th century is who's from the Maritimes? Someone who has a cousin or sibling in Boston. Relative to the rest of Canada, the Maritimes were really going through some hard times in the early 20th century. Its economy was in significant transition. My mom's side of the family, I've got red hair. That's where I get it from, the Scottish side, not this Irish last name. They came down from Nova Scotia at this time as well. One of the significant migration strains at the time was of women, single women, often moving to Boston and its surrounding area, and many of them were nurses, working in often at a time when a lot of nurses went into private homes. They were more likely to work in public hospitals, accepting relatively no pay, but they got to bunk often at the hospital. Well, during the Great Depression, as you were just referencing, some of these hiring laws privileging citizens vis-a-vis non-citizens was rediscovered, as a lot of the previously more desirable forms of nursing, those jobs went away. And a lot of these Canadian nurses, particularly in Boston and a couple towns surrounding it, were abruptly fired. And being fired at that time meant not just losing your job, but losing where they're literally the roof over their heads. It produced a brief but significant controversy both in Boston when it happened. Hospitals up in schools and schools and hospitals up in Canada expressed their outrage, to no avail. And then the following year, a much more even more significant purge of immigrant, again, often Canadian nurses in New York's public hospitals was undertaken.
Super interesting to go back and look at
Yeah.
some of these. We could talk a lot about a million things in this book.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about one more before we move on to some of your more
Please.
recent work, though. Expatriation Act. You kind of
Yeah.
referenced this in your
Yeah.
brief. 1907. You kind of, in your brief of the book, you kind of give a big picture 10,000-foot view of what this was about. But I'm curious if you can let us know the impact this may have had on some of those Canadian immigrant families that moved into the States.
Right. So I think one of the biggest things that stands out to me, just kind of in terms of individuals' lives, is it really depends on a person's life experience, whether this law dramatically affected them, and in some cases it really did, and in others it didn't affect them at all for decades until they learn or not that they were in fact no longer U.S. citizen of the place of their birth. Part of that might be because local authorities might not have known that this woman indeed wasn't an American citizen anymore because she's got a birth certificate, and they might not know about this federal law. The different ways where it really can matter materially are, again, trying to access certain types of jobs. Franco-American women, again, at a time here where we're talking particularly second-generation immigrants, so Franco-American women, Italian-American women, often marrying a man of their same, ethnicity, who was born abroad. And so if they choose to move abroad, with their husband back, they join their husband in Canada, et cetera, or Italy or wherever, coming back to the United States, that might be when they realize, I don't have, I can't get a passport because I'm not an American anymore. The presumption of this idea behind it is, she's going to acquire the citizenship of the country that her husband, is a national of. But not every country, affirmatively did that. So some women were indeed tended not to be. It was often Latin American countries, some other European countries were rendered stateless. They lost their American citizenship and did not acquire a nationality of their spouse. The story that I find overwhelmingly stands out from a Franco-American experience. A few really jump out. The first is 1928, when Al Smith is the first Catholic nominee for a presidential candidate nominated by a major political party, a Democrat. He gets walloped nationally in that election by a then popular Herbert Hoover. Won't be popular much longer. He flips two states, and they're in New England, and they're largely on the backs of Catholic voters coming out, and a lot of Catholic women registering to vote, and Catholic immigrant women naturalizing and then registering to vote. Rhode Island is one of the case studies I have in that chapter. I went through the naturalization paperwork in Rhode Island in the 1920s and 30s, and you see a significant uptick of immigrant women in general, and just by looking at some names, some French Canadian women naturalizing, they got swept up in that tide too. The other thing is just 1940. So 1940 is this, the U.S. is getting ready to potentially enter World War II. The U.S. isn't at war yet, but a series of laws are coming into force at roughly the same time. Two of them really sharpen distinctions between who is or isn't a citizen, one of which is the Alien Registration Act. So anyone who isn't a citizen, with few exceptions, has to show up at their local post office by Christmas and register, provide identifying information about themselves, how they got to the country, what are their civic associations, what have you. And in return, they're going to be given a registration number, and later that will be printed on a green card, which it's not a direct relationship, but in many historians have characterized this as kind of the beginning, the assumption that immigrants have to possess papers, or all non-citizens have such papers. So that's happening in 1940 at the same time as the laws governing how these marital expatriates can regain their citizenship if they so choose is also abruptly changing. Both the context of I have to go to the post office and declare I'm a citizen or not, plus these laws, some of them being inadvertently contradictory we see a significant uptick of all women of all ethnicities, and in New England, a lot of French Canadian women regaining their citizenship at that time as well, both for affirmative reasons, the war effort, all that stuff, plus the sharpening of these laws.
I do want to move on though to some of your more recent work, if we can.
Please.
So we could talk about this book forever. But I think it's going to be, because I think a lot of your recent work would be particularly interesting to a lot of the listeners of this podcast, especially maybe some of those who have a similar background to me with my K through 12 education in Catholic school, to kind of see with some of the work you're talking about, kind of church-state relations.
I am, yeah.
And can you just give us kind of an overview of kind of what that is?
When I was writing this dissertation, then turning into a book, one of the things I learned in writing a book is that there are these long gaps when you send in materials to your editor and then or potential editor and then editor, and then you wait and you hope for good news, and then you wait for feedback and you hope that's good news and all that stuff. As I was waiting, I was trying to figure out, okay, what's the next project going to be, and rather than starting a whole second book while I'm in the middle of this first one, why don't I try to split it up into chunks that might be an article here or there, and figure out if it's what I really want to do. I was talking earlier about that 1890s a self-described political reformer saying, oh, we can't possibly enfranchise immigrants or else we'll turn into Canada, and we know what's happening to Canada, it's just falling apart. It's like, okay, that's an interesting idea. Why were some American people engaged in politics, looking to Canada as a negative model? And so that was my entryway. And I just spent a lot of time kind of skimming current affairs journals, religiously affiliated papers, newspapers, to try to track, like, all right, when is Canada coming up in the debates, largely by politically connected individuals, but also more popular culture. And so much of it has to do with church-state relations, particularly the role of the Catholic Church in the Canadian political system. The most famous debate going on in Canada at the time was known as the Manitoba Schools Question, which was this lengthy controversy whereby it's highly technical, but the gist of it is that when Canada was formed as a confederation in 1867, the four founding what turned into provinces have their preceding educational system incorporated into what is basically Canadian constitutional law, governed by the British Constitution, because it's this slow evolutionary process.
Sure.
But in Quebec, that meant there's a Catholic public school system, predominantly French-speaking with some English language components, largely for the Irish, and a Protestant public school system. Ontario comes in with a public school system and a taxpayer-supported Catholic separate school system, more or less equivalent, very similar to what they're doing in Quebec. Manitoba is the first province created by that new Canadian government, but it wasn't one of the original ones, so its educational system doesn't have the same degree of, well, you're a lawyer, Jesse, what the lawyers might call establishment protectionism that those other provinces had. It starts out as adopting the Quebec model, Catholic public schools, Protestant public schools, but by the 1890s, the province is overwhelmingly Protestant, particularly Anglo, sometimes Irish Protestant extraction, and there's an attempt to repeal that Catholic public school system in Manitoba, and it produces this lengthy series of legal appeals all the way to London in England. There's an attempt to get the federal government to disallow that provincial law, and it's just this. It goes from more or less 1890 to 1897, super lengthy series of debates within Manitoba, about, within Canada more broadly, about what was the nature of the protections for French Canadians outside of Quebec. And what blew my mind was just how much coverage this dispute got in the United States. The New York Times frequently covering this on the front page, and even issuing editorial coverage at times about it. Like, this is more or less, what can and should be done. So that got me into, all right, this newer project, which is why did Americans care about what's going on in Canada in the 1890s? And in many respects, it's because a lot of anti-Catholic activists in the United States, at the time there's one particularly strong group called the American Protective Association, are pointing to Canada and saying, this is everything that goes wrong. And
Sure.
if we're not careful, the Catholics, quote unquote, and largely immigrants, but also domestic, Catholic populations, are going to try to do the same thing to American democracy. And they're going to try to have Catholic public schools in the United States. And they're going to try to replace our constitutional republic with one that is more and more subservient to, they would describe it as subservient to Rome, that has more overlap between church and state that is common at the time to Canada. And indeed, at the time, there are some American Catholic leaders who are pointing to Canada and saying, actually, that looks great. Like, parochial schools cost a lot of money to maintain.
Sure.
We would love to have a Catholic separate school system. Sounds great. Not all Catholics thought this. Quite a few said, this is actually really dangerous. If we go this route, we're putting ourselves under the supervision of the government, and they can yank that away at any time down the line. So it's not as easy as saying Catholics versus Protestants. There are intense debates,
Sure.
each of these segments. But anyway, a couple years ago, I put out the first piece of this newer project about how American political actors, from anti-Catholic activists, the American Protective Association most especially, to Catholic leaders and individuals in between, responded to that Manitoba schools question and the many ways it informed Catholic school politics in the 1890s. And the long and short, the thing that most surprised me by the end was realizing that the compromise that the Canadians came up with to kind of get out of this, to paper over that deep dispute in Manitoba, paradoxically looks a lot like a couple attempted compromises in the United States, which, so as Americans were debating whether Canada should or shouldn't be a model, the Canadians were doing the exact same thing, and kind of use it to not resolve, because the Manitoba schools question isn't properly resolved, but at least paper over and take a lot of the fire, the strength out of that particular fire.
Yeah, it's funny because what I found when I was going into this article, which I thought, I'm like, why in the world does the American care so much at all about what is happening in an internal debate in Manitoba
Yep.
about what they're going to do with their school system? But then how it is all linked together and
Yeah.
used as an example. It's pretty wild to see the
It is.
coverage
Right.
that it was getting and how much impact it had.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's super, super fascinating. So you're still going to go down this road though?
That's the plan. Yeah, I've got another piece that it's currently under review.
Nice.
It's more or less, so if the first piece that I put out a couple years ago in the Catholic Historical Review is really one in which anti-Catholic activists succeed in more or less doing what I kind of see as Canadianizing American nativism, and taking a model that is very Canada informed and translating it to a more broader American audience. I'm flipping the script about an attempt when that really didn't work, and attempts to translate kind of Canadian models and saying this is equivalent to what American patriots and or anti-Catholics activists should be doing when it did not work, and that particularly plays out in the dimension of national security, U.S. and British relations. There's a very brief war scare between the United States and Great Britain in the winter of 1895 and 1896. And this puts Canada in the crosshairs, because any war between the United States and Great Britain at that time probably would have been fought in Canada. And
Sure.
So that's where that alignment does not hold.
No, that's awesome. It is cool because, I mean, I was going through your book in this article, it did strike me how just relevant, I mean, this is our history, but how relevant it is to a lot of what we're talking about now. Obviously, the discussion over immigration and citizenship everywhere, at least in New Hampshire for sure, a very active debate about whether something like school vouchers should be allowed to be used to pay for Catholic schools. So though part of our history, this is still these discussions are still very, very much part of our present right now.
Right. The one big difference that I see here is that in the 1890s, there was a substantial component of the kind of self-described nativist, and sometimes they self-articulate as we are a patriotic order, and use that as like a tool to make claims to, how they can lobby politicians, etc. Some of these forces, not all, by no means all, but some argued basically Catholic immigrants are, due to their loyalty to the Pope, inimical to American
Sure.
democracy, and that alone served as, a cudgel against these Catholic immigrants. What in debates about, and whether or not they should have access to parochial schools and to what degree they should be surveilled or and how they'd be funded, right? That's the lay of the land in the 1890s of much of the debate. Catholic school vouchers debates in 2020s, we don't have that today.
For sure.
But to your point, questions over who can claim belonging or not, and these types of who should be treated with standing or not, I would say extremely relevant for today.
I think we could talk about this for this time has absolutely flown by. But I do want to get to one more question before we let you go, though. Maybe kind of big picture, especially in kind of the atmosphere we see ourselves in right now, between Canada and the United States. What kind of challenges, opportunities do you see for kind of the Canadian studies / Franco-American history studies kind of going forward?
Yeah, I would say, and I'm certainly not the first to say this, I echo many of my peers who work in Canadian studies. A lot of times it can be challenging to convince folks not already in this space, be it kind of Franco-American cultural community to academic centers that study Canada, Quebec, Franco-North America, what have you, to make a case to others not working in that area that, hey, come on over. Like,
sure,
you're going to learn something, and you're really going to go away and able to take something away from it, whether or not you choose to work in this area yourself. You're going to learn something that's going to be valuable. And part of that has just been, I think, given how, until the past few years, how taken for granted the U.S.-Canada relationship has been, as something that need not be in the news as much, because why would it be? Closest ally, closest neighbor, integrated economy, and just deeply enmeshed peoples coming and going across borders to this day. The past year and a half has, seen such a curveball to that underlying dynamic. I don't want to, paint a false picture. There are real challenges going ahead because of the geopolitical tensions and the way that they've got these tentacles that go off in different dimensions. Canadian not traveling to Florida for vacation anymore at the same rates. We got FIFA coming up. That's a shared project. Let's see how that goes. I
sure.
really do hope it goes well.
Yeah,
but
no kidding.
There are going to be tensions. The potential silver lining from the dimension of like us on this side of the border, on the U.S. side of the border, is that those of us who care about Canada, who care about this relationship, who care about individuals of Canadian extraction, of Franco extraction, we have an opportunity now to have a bigger audience to make the case that this matters in 2020, in 2024, in 2026, and going forward, both for political economy and how we can grow our steady and stable economies for the next generation as we navigate the AI changed world, but also that these histories, this culture, this tradition also has had ups and downs, and we can learn from it and hopefully move forward more productively. So biggest challenges, those of us who work in academia, it's never, I would say the current challenges that pervade higher ed are present here too. Ability to, assign reading and concentrate, and in this facing all the challenges of AI, that's something that we all face. Canadian studies, academia writ large, budgetary restraints, what have you. But I really do hope that a silver lining from the current dynamic academia, in the broader community of individuals who really care about this history, this relationship, are able to use a platform and speak to others who otherwise might be disinterested and make a case and say, hey, this matters, it has mattered, and it's going to matter moving forward too. Let's learn from it.
A very interesting discussion, a very timely discussion. So I feel really, really privileged to be able to speak with you about this. It's kind of funny now. We talk about, at least among my circles, we talk about the issue of immigration in Canada. It's now flipped a lot because with the new law opening up citizenship possibilities to people like myself and to Mike and to my sister and her kids, that kind of thing. And it's still a very, very relevant, very, very important conversation going forward. So,
and I would just make a pitch, given as someone who works in a Canadian-sized program, never hesitate to reach out to the Canadian consulates, their staff, and for cultural events and others, the Quebec delegations. The presence and that relationship continues, and the individuals there are very hardworking and they're real resources. So if you have a question, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, that's definitely true. We've been fortunate to have some members of the Quebec delegation on this podcast before. They're super awesome people.
Très bien fait.
So we've been speaking with Dr. Brendan Shanahan. It's been fun. Dr. Shanahan, if people want to get your book or follow your work, where can we send them?
Absolutely. So, I teach at Yale. You can find me on the Yale website. I am not Brendan Shanahan, the hockey player, so it might take a little bit of extra time to find me on Google. Has always been that way. My book, Disparate Regimes, was published by Oxford University Press last year, so you can find it there on their website or on Amazon, any online bookseller really that sells such books.
Well, Dr. Shanahan, thank you very much. Really appreciate the conversation.
It was an absolute pleasure, Jesse. Thank you, and thank you to your team and to all your listeners out there. I hope the spring brings warm weather as soon as possible for those of us in the Northeast.
You got that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.